Okay, hi everybody, this is Lilith and I'm one of your IAs for BIPN 160. In this video, I'll do a review of lecture 4. So we started talking about the spinal cord, and let me erase this little hand that I drew here earlier, but we'll get back to that. So in talking about the spinal cord, there are a few landmarks that you want to be familiar with. So this top portion is part of the brainstem. Then we have the following portion, that is the solid portion of the spinal cord. And then everything below that is something that is called the cauda equina or cauda equina, and that is where we no longer have any solid spinal cord, and instead we have just tracts and tracts of nerves coming off of the spinal cord. Okay, that is where spinal tap is taken, or before birth, for individuals who are giving birth, the epidural, I believe, is given in that area also. Okay. Now let's move on to the inside of the spinal cord. So if we take a cross section over here and we look inside of the spinal cord, this is what we will see. We will see that there is a butterfly-shaped gray matter in the middle, and this gray matter is surrounded by white matter. Then we will see that there are dorsal roots coming out of the gray matter, and then there are ventral roots. We will see the dorsal root ganglion, which is an enlarged portion of this nerve, and then we will see how the dorsal root and the ventral root come together to make up a spinal nerve, a peripheral spinal nerve. Okay. Another structure that you want to pay attention to is the sympathetic ganglion. This sympathetic ganglion, and all of them, there's many right next to the spinal cord on both sides. The sympathetic ganglion is a place where the neurons coming out of the CNS, so in this case the spine, they synapse with peripheral nerves that are going to either innervate different organs or glands of the body. Okay, to do a small demonstration, so to make sure that you understand how information comes into the spine and into the CNS and then how it comes out, I'll go ahead and draw the little hand that I had over here. Is that enough fingers? I think so, 5. So let's say that this is my hand, and with this hand I touch something. Let's say I touch a cup of coffee, right? So here's a cup, and I touch it and I say, wow, that's nice and cold. Well, how did I come to that conclusion? The sensory neurons that are in my fingers, right, they sensed that this cup of coffee is cold. So the sensory neuron will travel this information along my arm. This nerve will go into this nerve root that is near the spinal cord, near my spinal cord, and then this information will continue throughout this nerve, but it will split to the dorsal rootlet, because remember that the dorsal side is the sensory side of the spinal cord. It will go through the dorsal root. It will synapse, or it will synapse with a cell body, a neuron body, at the dorsal horn of the gray matter. Then it will travel to the back, for example, the dorsal white column, or to the lateral side, because in both places, dorsal and lateral places, we have sensory tracts. And then the sensory tract will take the information up to the brain. Okay, now that this information is up in the brain, let's say this is my brain, Then in the brain, we will have some interneurons, and the sensory neuron that just put information into the brain will be traveled to a motor area. And so then a motor neuron from my brain will come down my spinal cord through using a ventral column, ventral funiculus. Remember that the ventral funiculi is where the motor tracts are at. Also the lateral, so either lateral or ventral funiculi contain motor tracts. After this comes down the ventral white matter tract, then it will go ahead and synapse somewhere in the ventral horn of the gray matter. And then this neuron will come out of the ventral root, because remember again that ventral side of the spinal cord is all about motor activities. Then this neuron will travel through this nerve, out this nerve, into my arm, and then it will innervate a muscle or some muscles in my hand, and then I will either keep my hand there because I like to feel the cold cup of coffee, or I will move it because it's getting too cold. So hopefully that wasn't too convoluted. You're welcome to always send me emails, and I will provide more explanation on that. But that's just for your basic understanding of how inputs to the brain and outputs take place. So let's look at this picture again, because I probably should have explained the whole funiculi business before I did that, but I'll do this now and you're welcome to rewind the video. So let's look at the white matter of the spinal cord. So here, 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 and here is all white matter. The dorsal portion, called dorsal funiculus, is the area of the white matter that contains mostly sensory tracts. The lateral funiculus is a place that contains both sensory and motor tracts. And then the ventral funiculus is where we have mostly motor tracts. Okay, the dorsal horn of the gray matter of this butterfly contains cell bodies of neurons that are sensory information carriers. And then the ventral horn contains cell bodies of neurons that are motor neurons. Okay, in the middle over here we have the central canal. Central canal is a canal that runs all the way through the spinal cord, and it also connects to the different ventricles in the brain that we will talk about later in the quarter. The ventricles and the central canal, as you remember, contain the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, which nourishes the central nervous system. And there's also a ventral sulcus. I'm not sure if Dr. Root talked about this too much, but it's just a small separation between we can call them the right and the left, from my point of view. Okay. Some things that you should know for this class that will serve you well during exams, I think, would be to memorize exactly which nerves are responsible for which part of the body. So, for example, cervical nerves 1 through 8 are responsible for the neck, shoulders, and superior side of the arms. And then a part of the thoracic is inferior side of the arms, another part of the thoracic is upper torso, and so on. So if you can commit these numbers to memory, or know exactly where they are in your notes because your exam is open note, then that will serve you well. Okay, now let's move on to talking about the organization of the nervous system. So hopefully by now you figured out that there are two parts of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system and we have the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Both of these structures contain both motor and sensory tracts. The peripheral nervous system contains two nervous systems within itself. It contains the somatic nervous system, which is a part of the PNS that deals with either gathering information, so sensory, or giving information, motor, to the skin and the muscles of our body. And then the autonomic nervous system, or otherwise called the visceral nervous system, is part of the PNS that deals with gathering information, gathering sensory information, or sending motor information to the viscera of our body. And viscera means organs or tissues or glands. Okay? Two important subsets of the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. We'll talk more about these on this next page when I move on there, but start to think that sympathetic is associated with the fight or flight response when you are in danger. And the parasympathetic nervous system is associated with relaxation, rest and digest. So we'll talk more about that in a second. And I also wanted to talk about the distinctions between the somatic and autonomic nervous system. So in this picture right here, let's see what the difference is in neuron and pathway structure. So in part A over here, we see how this neuron is a somatic motor neuron. How do we know this? We know that this is a somatic neuron because we only see one neuron. In the autonomic or visceral nervous system, we see two neurons. So we see a preganglionic or presynaptic neuron, and then after a synapse, we see the postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron. So one distinction is that somatic nervous system has only one neuron, and the autonomic or visceral nervous system has two neurons. Then, how do we know that this is a motor neuron? We know this because we see that the cell body is projecting from the part of the spinal cord that is the ventral horn. And as you remember, the ventral side of the spinal cord cross-section is all about motor actions. And of course, we see this big bicep muscle, right? And if there's a neuron that is innervating a muscle, then we know that this is a motor neuron. Okay. Something else I want to mention about part B of the structure is that the autonomic nervous system contains an autonomic ganglion. So if we are talking about the sympathetic nervous system, then the sympathetic ganglion, which we looked at over here, if you remember this thing, sympathetic ganglion is right next to the spinal cord, and that is where this synapse of the pre- and postganglionic neurons happens. But if we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, then the ganglion is going to be in a place that is much closer to the organ of innervation. Okay, and as you see here, the organ that this neuron is affecting is an internal organ, right? This is our large colon. So this will not be a muscle. If this was a muscle, then that would be a somatic neuron. Okay, let me see if I didn't miss anything here. I don't think so. Okay, so now I will move on and talk about this structure really quickly over here. Make sure to know that the sympathetic nervous system, which is on this left side, I'll write an S for sympathetic. Sympathetic nervous system has the part of the spinal cord that is controlling the sympathetic nervous system is the thoracic part and a few of the lumbar regions. Okay, they mostly affect muscle cells, right? So the heart muscle, different smooth muscle in the trachea and in our lungs. The stomach has a muscle. I believe there is a muscle in the duct of the gallbladder, so that is why this one is projecting to the liver. Okay, there's smooth muscle in the intestines and so on. Pay attention to the sympathetic ganglia over here, right next to the spinal cord, as we talked about earlier. Okay, then let's look at the right side where the parasympathetic nervous system is shown. In contrast to the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system has the brainstem controlling most of the parasympathetic action, and then some of the sacral regions also. As you can see, the parasympathetic nervous system does not have the sympathetic ganglion, and instead the ganglia that it synapses in are right here, and they are much closer to the organs of interest. Okay. And another thing I want to reiterate, because these are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which are both part of the autonomic nervous system, both of these have, they are, I believe, I forget what Dr. Root called it, but they have two neurons. So the presynaptic and the postsynaptic. Same here, presynaptic and postsynaptic. It was the somatic nervous system that contains only one neuron. Okay. Now let's talk about this chart. An easy way of remembering all of this, the effects of the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. I like to think of this scary scenario of I am in a room and a very scary lion walks in, right? Now, what will happen to me when I see this lion? Obviously, I'm going to think that I'm about to die, right? So in that case, what will happen is my sympathetic nervous system will be activated like crazy. My arteries that are going to my skin, for example, will be constricted. That is why many people turn white when they are afraid of something, right? When they are scared, because the arteries that are going to your skin are constricted and you lose your pinkish color of your face. My heart rate will increase because I need to pump more blood throughout my body so I can run away from this lion. My bronchial muscles will relax, because if they relax, then that means I can take deeper breaths, again contributing to my chances of running away from this lion. My bladder muscle will relax also. And if the bladder muscle relaxes, that means I will not have the urge to urinate. And that's also a good fight or flight effect, because when you're trying to run away from danger, it's definitely not the time to, stop and urinate and do all the gastrointestinal activities. You just want to run away. And then the genital arteries will either dilate or constrict. This is a tricky one because I don't think well, let's just skip the genital one because it doesn't fit with my lion scenario. But during a sexual activity, I think both of these, either dilation or constriction of arteries in the genitals, takes place. And then the sweat glands will start to secrete fluids, because if I'm running away from the lion, then I'm also sweating because my body needs to cool off. Okay, and then the same thing happens, but in opposite, in the parasympathetic nervous system. So for example, there is no lion, it's a Sunday morning and I'm relaxing, then my arteries to my skin will be dilated, my heart rate will be lower because there's no danger that is posed to my life. My bronchial muscles will be contracted because I don't need to be taking deep breaths. The bladder muscle can contract if I need to urinate. Genital arteries are dilated. I don't know too much about this, but I guess you can just commit that to memory. And then my sweat glands won't really be working because if I'm just chilling there enjoying a cup of coffee, then there is only a relaxation effect and no fight or flight. So hopefully that scenario of me explaining how I almost die in this lion scenario will help you memorize this. And I will move on to talk about the ascending pathways and the decussations of the sensory tracts. Okay, so there are 4 ascending pathways that Dr. Root wants you to know and know them well. So the first one is the dorsal column right here. I've highlighted it in purple. This tract carries sensory information that pertains to fine touch and proprioception. On this lateral side, we have the spinocerebellar tract, and this carries information only for proprioception. On this front side, we have a tract that is called anterior spinothalamic tract, and it contains information that pertains to crude touch and pressure. And then on another lateral side, we have lateral spinothalamic tract, and this carries information about pain and temperature. So you want to memorize this chart right here that Dr. Root provided for you, and it's just a summary of the ascending pathways, their function, and their site of decussation. To review, decussation means for neurons to change sides. So if one neuron is traveling on the right side, at some point, either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord, it can cross the midline and go to the left side, and that is called decussation. It's important for you to memorize which tracts decussate in which place, because this can be a good test question in terms of showing an injury to a certain part of the spine, and then, the test question asking you, well, what kind of function is going to be lost? And you can only answer that if you've remembered where these decussations are. Okay, I suggest only remembering the dorsal column decussates at the brainstem because the rest decussate at the spinal cord. So as long as you remember that this one's different, then the other ones are the same. Okay. Then moving on to the descending pathways and their decussation sites. There are 4 pathways that you should probably know by name and function, but then there are only 3 that you need to know decussation-wise. So let's go over the 4. The first one is lateral corticospinal tract, and this carries motor information, because this is a descending pathway, motor information to our limbs, so our arms and our legs. The rubrospinal tract is a tract that carries motor information to fine control of our hands. So for example, typing on your laptop or peeling an orange. I don't know why I thought of that example, but that's, fine control of our hands. The lateral vestibulospinal tract carries motor information to our posture muscles. So just sitting upright, those are the muscles that are constantly working so I don't slouch off. And then the last one is the anterior corticospinal tract, and this tract carries motor information to use in somebody's trunk. So I think that would be torso. I'm not sure. I might have to Google trunk. But to give you a summary of the descending pathways, their function, and the decussation site, here is this chart. And again, you should definitely memorize this. easy way of memorizing it, only memorize that the anterior corticospinal tract decussates at the spinal cord, and then everything else is at the brainstem. Okay, again, these could be good places for a question on the exam, possibly multiple questions. So over here, I did my best to draw out the two different pathways so that you can have a visual, and maybe this can help you, but I'll go over it. So this is supposed to be a part of the spinal cord, and so is this. Then this is the brainstem, and then a wrinkly brain. So let's start with the red pathways first, because the red pathways I've depicted to be the sensory tract. So you see how if this is a sensory tract that decussates at the brainstem, then it would look something like this. It would go up all the way through the spine until it hits the brainstem. It will decussate and go up to the brain. This other one that I drew is one that decussates at the spinal cord, so it will go up through the spinal cord. At some point, still in the spinal cord, it will decussate, and it will keep going into the brainstem, past the brainstem, into the brain. Okay, so there you go. That's two versions of an ascending pathway, crossing at the brainstem and crossing at the spinal cord. Now let's look at the same for some example of motor pathways. Coming down from here, this is a motor neuron that's coming down. It passes the brainstem. It did not cross at the brainstem. It crosses at the spinal cord, and it goes all the way down to wherever it needs to go. So that decussated at the spinal cord. And then this next one comes down through the brain, gets to the brainstem, crosses over, and then just goes all the way down the spinal cord wherever it needs to go. Okay, and that decussation happens at the brainstem. So I suggest you are familiar with drawing this out, or at least picturing it in your head, because when you're asked questions about an injury that's pertained, that has happened to the spinal cord. I remember when I took this class, I would always try to visualize these 4 types of pathways, and just see, okay, well, if the injury happened over here, is the tract that they're talking about, is the decussation below this injury, or is it above this injury? One good tip that might help you is if the decussation happens before the injury, so above the injury, so the injury, let's draw this out. Let's say the injury is right here on the left side of the patient, because we're looking at this spine and brain as a person. So if this is where the injury happens, then we say, okay, well, which tract do we want to talk about? If we are talking about a motor tract, let's say this blue one, then if the injury has happened over here and it cut through this blue tract, then we can safely say that the right side of the body will be affected, because this tract goes and crosses later into the right side. Okay? But if we were wanting to see this tract, then if this part is injured, then we would have to look at so these tracts, there's 2 of them, right? So one on each side. So if this one goes from here to here, then this one goes from here to here. So in this case, if our injury is right here, then the part of the body that will lose the motor control would be the same side, so it would be the left side, because this is where the neuron continues at. Okay, hopefully that made sense. I know on the Discord channel some people had questions about it, but we can always go over this more during discussion or office hours. Okay, and that's all I prepared for this lecture. I'll go over these questions in case you missed them during lecture. Okay, so number 5, the ventral root of the spinal cord carries which type of information? Again, hopefully by now you know the drill. Try to think of the answer before I answer it. So the ventral root will be mostly motor information. So C is the answer for this one. Number 6, which of the following is true regarding the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems? Let me go through the answers so I don't read all of them. So it's definitely not C. That's the first one I looked at, but it's not C because the parasympathetic system regulates the sense of smell. No. Not D. It regulates appetite. I think it's B. The sympathetic nervous system coordinates a fight or flight response, whereas the parasympathetic maintains routine functions of internal organs. So I'll go ahead and highlight B as the right answer. Okay, number 7 is which is the correct order of gross spinal segments from head to toe. If this is something you didn't know, gross means just pure anatomical. When they're talking about gross structures, it's just looking at anatomy. So the order would be cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. So let's see, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, so it would be B. Okay, number 9, I guess we skipped 8. Number 9, the dorsal column tract is the spinal cord. The dorsal column tract in the spinal cord carries which type of sensory information? And if you remember from the chart, I believe it was fine touch and proprioception. It's not specified fine touch, but touch and proprioception is the closest answer. It's not visual, olfactory, and auditory, and pain and temperature, I believe, was, what was it? Lateral spinothalamic. Right there. Okay, but the answer to this one is fine touch and proprioception. All right, let's go back. Number 13, spinal reflexes are simple circuits that typically involve, and I didn't talk about the reflex in this video because I feel like Dr. Root already explained it very well, so definitely look at the lecture recordings of the class, but I can always answer questions on that if you'd like. The answer to this question would probably be sensory neurons synapsing onto motor neurons right here, because the big point about reflexes is that because it is a reflex, the sensory information doesn't travel all the way to your brain. It is just synapsed and resolved within your spinal cord. Okay, number 25, your uncle was in a car accident, suffered a back injury. Okay, so this individual has numbness, entire left leg, but no problems moving the leg. So this already tells us that there's a problem with his sensory neurons, however, not the motor neurons. And the question asks, which spinal root is this at which spinal segment? So spinal root, remember that we have 2 types of roots. We have the dorsal root and the ventral root. Because he has numbness, then this will be the dorsal root, because dorsal root has to do with the sensory information. At which spinal segment? Does this say herniated disc? Yeah, I think Dr. Root said that there's a problem with this question because herniated discs don't really just numb your whole leg, but let's just say it did. So we will just say lumbar, because lumbar injuries are usually affecting a bigger part of your leg. Okay, these are your learning objectives for this lecture. Make sure to go over them. Make sure that you know everything that Dr. Root is asking you to know. I feel like the learning objectives and the previous questions like this one will be a good way to practice. And the problem sets. They are all good ways to practice for the exam. Okay, that's it. Again, my name is Lilith. If you have any questions that I can help with, office hours Monday 7 p.m. or you can email me or message me through Canvas. All right, I will post lecture 5 review in a little bit. Thank you.